The first flakes of snow began their descent as the carriage, a lumbering beast of lacquered black and gleaming brass, navigated the final winding stretch of driveway towards Haversham Manor. Inside, Miss Eleanor Swift watched them through the chilled glass, her breath forming a faint mist on the pane. Each snowflake was a perfect, intricate star, a herald of the inconvenience to come. Eleanor did not care for inconveniences. At 26, she was a woman who prided herself on order, on foresight, on the quiet, unyielding application of logic. This house party, a fortnight of forced merriment and social niceties at the estate of her dear, if somewhat flighty friend Lady Arabella, was already a significant deviation from her preferred quiet Christmas in London. A snowstorm threatened to transform it into an ordeal. "Oh, look, Eleanor. It's starting." Arabella, seated opposite, clapped her gloved hands together, her face alight with a joy Eleanor could not fathom. "It will be a true Christmas. Just like in the stories." "It will be a true impediment to travel," Eleanor corrected gently, though not without affection. "I trust the larders are well stocked?" "Of course. Mama saw to everything. And Uncle Bertram is here, and he always tells the most wonderful long-winded stories. And Cousin Cecilia is playing the pianoforte, and there will be charades and a Yule log and—" Arabella's chatter continued, painting a picture of relentless festivity that made Eleanor's temples throb. The carriage drew to a halt before the imposing facade of Haversham Manor. It was a grand old Elizabethan structure, all gables and mullioned windows, now draped in a festive, if slightly ragged veil of ivy and holly. Torches flickered in sconces either side of the great oak door, their light catching the thickening swirl of snow. They were ushered into a grand hall, where a colossal Christmas tree, bedecked with candles and gilded nuts, scented the air with pine. The warmth from the two great fireplaces was a welcome assault. The party was already assembled for pre-dinner drinks, a kaleidoscope of silks, velvets, and chatter. It was then that Eleanor saw him. Across the room, leaning against the marble mantelpiece as if he found the very concept of its support beneath him, was Lord Julian Blackwood. He held a glass of brandy, swirling its amber contents with a languid indifference that seemed to create a force field of solitude around him. He was tall, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead, and features that were sharp, intelligent, and currently arranged in an expression of profound boredom. His eyes, a cool, assessing gray, met hers for a fleeting second. There was no spark of interest, no flicker of acknowledgement beyond the bare minimum required by politeness. It was a look that said, quite clearly, another one. Eleanor felt her spine straighten. She knew of Lord Blackwood, of course. The cynical Earl, as the gossip sheets sometimes dubbed him. A man of vast wealth and little apparent joy, known for his razor-sharp wit that could flay a person at 20 paces. He was Arabella's cousin, and his presence here was, apparently, a reluctant familial duty. Dinner was a long, noisy affair. Eleanor was seated between a retired general who discoursed at length on the strategic deficiencies of the Roman phalanx and a young poet who sighed dramatically into his syllabub. She managed both with polite, efficient nods, her attention occasionally drifting to the head of the table where Lord Blackwood held court in the most passive-aggressive manner possible. When Arabella's mother, Lady Fitzwilliam, enthused about the magic of a white Christmas, Lord Blackwood had murmured, just loud enough for Eleanor to hear, "The magic of hypothermia and supply chain collapse, you mean? Enchanting." A snort of surprised laughter escaped Eleanor before she could stop it. Blackwood's eyes snapped to hers, a glint of something, annoyance? Interest? In their gray depths. He offered the faintest, most sardonic lift of his eyebrow. Eleanor quickly schooled her features into neutrality, but a strange, unwelcome sense of alliance flickered within her. Later, as the ladies retired, leaving the gentlemen to their port, the wind began to howl in earnest. By the time the gentlemen rejoined them, the cheerful snowfall had transformed into a raging blizzard. The windows rattled in their frames, and the world beyond the glass was a swirling, impenetrable white. It was Lord Blackwood who voiced the collective, dawning horror. He had parted the heavy velvet curtains and stood staring out into the maelstrom. "Well," he said, his voice cutting through the festive chatter like a shard of ice. "It appears we are trapped." A stunned silence fell over the drawing-room. The jovial Uncle Bertram paused mid-anecdote. The poet looked genuinely terrified. "Trapped?" squeaked Cousin Cecilia. "For how long?" Blackwood let the curtain fall back into place. "Until the storm abates and the drifts, which are likely already several feet high, can be cleared. Which, given the ferocity of this little tantrum of nature, will not be tomorrow. Or the day after." Panic, quiet and insidious, began to seep into the room. The Christmas house party had just become a prison. The morning confirmed Lord Blackwood's grim prediction. A world of pure, unadulterated white lay beyond every window, a beautiful, silent, and utterly impassable prison. Drifts climbed halfway up the ground floor windows, and the sky remained a leaden gray, promising more to come. The initial novelty of the situation wore off by mid-morning, replaced by a restless, petty chaos. The heating in the West Wing had failed, leading to a mass migration of disgruntled guests and a fierce argument over the best rooms. The cook, a formidable woman named Mrs. Dabney, was in a state of high dudgeon because the storm had prevented the delivery of the prize goose and the special order of French champagne. 2 of the young footmen had gotten into a scuffle over a maid, resulting in a shattered spode vase. And Lady Fitzwilliam had taken to her bed with a case of the nerves, leaving a leadership vacuum that was rapidly being filled by hysteria. Eleanor, having fortified herself with a strong cup of tea and a review of the manor's layout, found Arabella wringing her hands in the morning room. "Oh, Eleanor, it's a disaster. Mama is indisposed, the guests are at each other's throats, and cook says we shall have to make do with salted pork for Christmas dinner." Salted pork. Salted pork, properly prepared, can be perfectly palatable, Eleanor said, her voice calm. The first priority is organization. We need to take stock of the provisions, consolidate the living quarters to conserve heat and firewood, and establish a routine for the guests. Idleness is the enemy in a situation like this. But how? I haven't the faintest idea where to begin. It was at that moment that Lord Blackwood entered, his expression suggesting he had just smelled something unpleasant. "The General is attempting to drill the footmen in snow-blindness maneuvers in the Great Hall," he announced. "And the poet is weeping in the library because the snow has murdered the muse. I formally withdraw my previous assessment. This is not a prison. It is a madhouse." Eleanor turned to him, a plan crystallizing in her mind with sudden, perfect clarity. He was cynical, yes, but he was also intelligent and, as the lord of a nearby estate, possessed a natural authority. She, on the other hand, had the practicality he so clearly disdained. They were, in this specific, absurd circumstance, the perfect, if unwilling, complements. "Lord Blackwood," she said, her tone brisk and businesslike. "A word." He looked at her with mild surprise. "Miss Swift, do you have a proposal for a mass breakout? A hot air balloon constructed from silk drapes, perhaps? Nothing so dramatic. I propose a truce. And a partnership." His eyebrow arched. "A partnership? You see the chaos as clearly as I do. Arabella is overwhelmed, Lady Fitzwilliam is incapacitated. Left to its own devices, this party will descend into full-blown anarchy within 48 hours. You have the authority. I have the organizational skills. Together we can manage this situation. We can impose order." He studied her, his gray eyes keen and assessing. He saw a woman of average height with a sensible if not unfashionable dark blue dress, hair pulled back in a simple but elegant chignon. Her face was not classically beautiful, but it was striking. High cheekbones, a firm mouth, and eyes of a clear, direct hazel that held his gaze without a hint of coquetry or uncertainty. "You are proposing we become the stewards of this festive bedlam?" he asked, a flicker of amusement finally touching his lips. "I am proposing we become the practical architects of its survival and, dare I say it, its eventual enjoyment. Will you help?" He was silent for a long moment, listening to the distant, raised voice of the General. He looked at Eleanor's resolute face, then at his cousin's pleading one. He let out a long, slow breath, a sigh of resignation that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "Very well, Miss Swift. You have a reluctant general for your campaign. What is your first order of business?" Their partnership began in the Manor's pantry, a cavernous, cold room that smelled of spices, dried herbs, and cold stone. Mrs. Dabney stood before them, arms crossed over her ample bosom, her expression thunderous. "I'll not be held responsible for the quality of the meals, my lord, miss," she declared. "No goose. No fresh cream. The citrus is low. It's a catastrophe." Eleanor, a ledger open in her hands, ignored the dramatics. "Let us assess what we do have, Mrs. Dabney. A full side of salted pork, yes? Barrels of flour, oats, dried peas. A substantial root cellar, I observed, potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions. Jams, preserves, a more than adequate supply of wine and brandy." "It's not about adequacy, miss. It's about Christmas," the cook wailed. "Christmas," Lord Blackwood interjected dryly, "is at its core a celebration. I fail to see how the specific protein on the plate alters the sentiment." Unless you worship the goose as a pagan deity, Mrs. Dabney. Eleanor shot him a warning look. Antagonizing the cook was not part of her strategy. What his lordship means, she said smoothly, is that we have an opportunity for creativity. A slow-roasted pork with a glaze made from the last of the apricot preserves and a dash of brandy. Mashed turnips with a hint of nutmeg. We shall make it a feast precisely because it is born of necessity. Mrs. Dabney looked slightly mollified. The word creativity had piqued her professional pride. This became the pattern of their days. Eleanor, with her lists and ledgers, was the strategist. Julian, with his title and his unnerving ability to silence a room with a single cool glance, was the enforcer. They moved the guests into the warmer east wing, turning the largest drawing room into a common area. Julian dealt with the general by appealing to his military sensibilities, putting him in charge of firewood logistics and reconnaissance of the weather from the library window. Eleanor tasked the weeping poet with compiling a book of stormbound verse from the library's collection, giving his melancholy a purpose. She organized reading groups, sewing circles for the ladies to mend old linens, presented as a charitable endeavor, and even a series of historical lectures by Uncle Bertram, whose long-windedness was now a scheduled asset rather than a tedious liability. They found themselves spending hours together, their heads bent over lists in the library, their low, urgent conversations a constant counterpoint to the general noise of the house. Eleanor was all efficiency and quiet competence. Julian was all sharp edges and drier-than-dust commentary, yet she began to detect a pattern. His cynicism was a shield. He deployed it most fiercely when faced with genuine emotion or incompetence, as if the sheer stupidity of the world was a personal affront he had to ward off with wit. One afternoon they were in the estate office trying to calculate the coal consumption. Eleanor's fingers were stained with ink, and a stray lock of hair had escaped its pins to curl against her temple. "You are remarkably good at this," Julian remarked, watching her neat columns of figures. "At herding these particular cats." "It is merely applied logic," she said, not looking up. "Most people, when anxious, simply require a task and the assurance that someone is in control. And you are never anxious, Miss Swift? Never unsettled by the unpredictable?" She paused, setting down her quill. "I find the unpredictable less unsettling when one is prepared to meet it with a plan. Unlike some, I do not believe the universe is inherently chaotic. Merely complex. A charming philosophy," he said, "and one that must be a great comfort when faced with a blizzard." She finally met his gaze. "It is no less a comfort than your philosophy, my lord, which seems to be to expect the worst so that you are never disappointed." A genuine smile, small and unexpected, touched his lips. It transformed his face, erasing years of jaded indifference. "Touché, Miss Swift." In that moment the professional distance between them shifted. It was no longer just a partnership of convenience. It was a conversation, a meeting of two formidable intellects on a strangely level playing field. The turning point came on the fourth day. The storm had finally ceased, leaving a world of breathtaking, silent beauty, but the snowdrifts were still impassable. A new problem arose. The well in the kitchen courtyard had frozen solid. Panic, this time genuine and not born of petty discomfort, rippled through the household. Water was a fundamental necessity. Julian for the first time looked truly grim. "The ice is too thick to break through conventionally. We'll have to organize a chain from the stream at the bottom of the hill. It's a quarter-mile away through snow up to a man's chest." It was a dangerous, exhausting proposal. The guests, now used to their managed comfort, rebelled. The general declared it a fool's errand. The poet predicted certain frostbite, and a chorus of complaints rose from the others. Eleanor saw the resolve in Julian's face begin to harden into isolation. He was preparing to do it himself, with only the footmen, and to hell with the rest of them. Without a word, Eleanor walked to the grand front door and began putting on her boots and the heavy fur-lined cloak she had packed with her characteristic foresight. "What are you doing?" Julian asked, his voice sharp. "I am joining the water chain," she said simply. "I may not be as strong as a footman, but I can carry a bucket. And my participation might encourage the others." "Don't be absurd. You'll freeze." "Then I shall freeze productively." She marched out into the blinding white world. The cold was a physical slap, taking her breath away. She trudged through the snow, following Julian and the small band of servants he had assembled. After a moment's stunned silence, others began to move. Shamed by her example, the general huffed and puffed his way into his greatcoat. Even the poet, after a dramatic shudder, followed. The work was back-breaking. A human chain was formed from the running stream to the manor. Buckets of frigid water were passed hand over hand. Snow seeped into boots, numb fingers fumbled, but no one stopped. Eleanor worked alongside a scullery maid, their shared struggle erasing all distinctions of class. She saw Julian at the head of the chain, his shoulders straining, his breath pluming in the air, not as a cynical lord but as a leader, a man willing to do the hardest work himself. At one point he passed her a bucket, their gloved hands brushing. His eyes, fierce and intent, held hers. "You are the most infuriatingly stubborn woman I have ever met," he said, his voice low. "Thank you," she replied, her own breath coming in gasps. "It is one of my best qualities." A laugh, rough and surprised, escaped him. It was swallowed by the vast, white silence. When the last barrel in the kitchen was filled, they stumbled back inside, exhausted, soaked, and triumphant. A sense of collective achievement warmed the house more effectively than any fire. That evening the mood was different. The guests were no longer prisoners, they were survivors. The conversation was louder, the laughter more genuine. Later, finding a moment of quiet in the library, Eleanor stood by the window, looking out at the star-dusted night. The door opened and Julian entered. He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You were magnificent today," he said quietly. The cynicism was entirely absent from his voice. It was raw, sincere. "We all were," she said, turning to look at him. His face was etched with fatigue, but his eyes were clear. "No. They followed because of you. Your practicality, your refusal to be daunted, it shamed them into being better versions of themselves." He paused, searching her face. "You see the world not as it is, but as it could be if someone simply had the sense to manage it properly. It's a revelation." Eleanor felt something warm and fragile uncurl within her chest. The pragmatic wall she had built around her heart, brick by logical brick, developed a crack. "And you," she whispered. "You see the world as it is in all its frustrating folly and you chose to act anyway. That is not cynicism, my lord. That is courage." He reached out, his fingers still cold from the outdoors, gently brushing the stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric. "Julian," he corrected softly. "My name is Julian." "Eleanor," she breathed. In the quiet of the firelit library, surrounded by the silent, snowbound world, the pragmatic lady and the cynical lord found they were no longer managing chaos. They were simply a man and a woman, discovering a warmth in each other's company that had nothing to do with fireplaces and everything to do with a connection that defied all their carefully constructed logic and defenses. The world began to thaw, both outside and within the walls of Haversham Manor. With the immediate crisis past and a new, unspoken understanding between them, Julian and Eleanor's management of the party became a seamless dance. They communicated with glances, with slight smiles, with the briefest touches as they passed a ledger or a cup of tea. The Christmas Eve dinner was no longer a potential disaster but a celebration of their shared triumph. The salted pork, glazed to a perfect, glossy brown, was declared the best anyone had ever tasted. The mood was jovial, the laughter easy. Even Uncle Bertram's stories were met with genuine warmth. Eleanor, sitting beside Julian, felt a happiness so profound it was almost unsettling. It was not logical. It was not planned. It simply was. After dinner, the guests gathered around the great tree. The candles were lit, their flames casting a golden, dancing light on the faces of the assembled party. It was beautiful, a scene from a dream she had never allowed herself to have. Julian stood and, to the surprise of everyone, picked up a small, wrapped package from beneath the tree. He walked to Eleanor and held it out. "A small token," he said, his voice low. "For the architect of our salvation." Everyone watched, curious and smiling. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she untied the string. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was not a piece of jewelry or a fan but a book. A first edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise and understanding. "A story," he said softly, for her ears only, "about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the pursuit of logic without heart. I thought it appropriate. And a reminder that even the most practical of us can be surprised by the humanity that finds us." Tears, hot and entirely illogical, pricked at the corners of her eyes. It was the most thoughtful, the most seen she had ever felt. He had not given her a trinket. He had given her a piece of his own mind, an acknowledgement of their intellectual sparring and the journey they had shared. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It is perfect." Later, as the clock ticked towards midnight, they found themselves alone on a small, secluded balcony overlooking the snow-covered gardens. The air was crisp and cold, the sky a velvet blanket of stars. "Eleanor," Julian began, turning to face her, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "When I arrived here, I thought this would be a fortnight of tedious social obligation. I thought I understood the world. I believed that joy was a delusion and connection a transaction. You have proven me wrong on every count." He took her hands in his. "Your practicality is not a coldness. It is a strength that kindles warmth in others. Your logic is not rigid. It is the framework upon which you build a better reality. You have shown me that the world is not something to be endured from a distance, but to be engaged with, to be managed, as you so brilliantly put it, with sense and with heart." He took a deep breath. "I find I do not wish to manage my world without you in it. The thought of you returning to London, of this alliance ending, is intolerable." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the greatest unpredictability of all. "What are you saying, Julian?" "I am saying that I love you, Eleanor Swift. I love your stubbornness, your lists, your infuriating competence, and the hidden, beautiful warmth I have found beneath it all. Marry me. Not because it is practical, though I suspect we would make an formidable team. Marry me because this feeling between us is the least logical, most necessary thing I have ever experienced." Tears streamed freely down Eleanor's face now, but she was smiling, a radiant, joyful smile that lit up her whole being. The final wall around her heart crumbled to dust. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and sure in the silent night. "1,000 times yes. For it would be the most profoundly practical, and the most wonderfully illogical decision of my life." He pulled her into his arms, and as his lips met hers, the cold air ceased to exist. The world was reduced to the warmth of his embrace, the steady beat of his heart against hers, and the silent, approving witness of the stars above. The storm had stranded them, but it had also delivered them to this perfect, unexpected shore. The Christmas Day sun rose on a transformed Haversham Manor. The snow was melting, and the sound of dripping water was a promise of freedom. But for once no one was in a hurry to leave. The announcement of their engagement at breakfast was met with universal delight. The general pumped Julian's hand vigorously, the poet declared it the most romantic story ever told, and promptly began a sonnet, and Arabella wept tears of joy all over Eleanor's shoulder. As the guests began their departures later that day, laden with farewells and promises to visit, Julian and Eleanor stood together at the same great door where they had first arrived as strangers. "It appears our management of the chaotic guests is at an end," Eleanor said, a hint of wistfulness in her voice. Julian slipped his hand into hers, his fingers lacing through hers with a natural, easy familiarity. "On the contrary, my love," he said, his gray eyes warm with a light she knew was reserved for her alone. "I suspect it is only just the beginning." And as they turned to walk back into their home, the pragmatic lady and the once cynical lord knew that the greatest magic of the season had not been in the snow, or the decorations, or the feast. It had been in the unexpected, warming fire they had found in each other's company, a fire that would burn brightly for all the seasons to come.